All right, so we've been looking in some really cool projects in the blockchain world, and two that have been particularly interesting are Hyperliquid and Aerodrome.
Yeah, definitely both very interesting in kind of different ways. But yeah, looking forward to unpacking them.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to take a deep dive into Hyperliquid and Aerodrome and see how they work, how they're different, maybe some surprising connections.
Yeah, and you've given me a ton of information, documentation, blog posts, so we're ready to kind of dig in and see what we can find.
Awesome. Yeah, so our mission today is to really extract like the key insights about what Hyperliquid is doing at the infrastructure level and then how Aerodrome kind of fits within this base ecosystem.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right, so why don't we just jump right in with Hyperliquid? And I'm just going to start with this quote from their documentation that really stood out to me. They say they're building a performant layer one blockchain for a fully on-chain open financial system. So right off the bat, they're aiming high.
Absolutely. And it sounds like they're really going for like this all-encompassing vision. They want to bring liquidity applications, trading
Yeah.
all onto this single platform.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold vision. And, if they can pull it off, it would have some big implications for how we think about finance.
For sure, things like transparency and control, putting users back in charge of their assets instead of relying on these traditional institutions.
Right, exactly. And it seems like their approach to actually building this is kind of unique. They're not just tweaking an existing blockchain, they're building Hyperliquid as layer one from the ground up.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. They've really optimized it from first principles specifically for high performance financial activity. They've developed their own consensus algorithm called HyperBFT, which is actually inspired by hot stuff.
Okay, HyperBFT hot stuff. These are not exactly household names. So for those of us who aren't like deep into consensus mechanisms, can you give us the quick rundown on what makes HyperBFT so important?
Sure. So the key thing to remember about HyperBFT and hot stuff is that they're all about speed and finality. Hot stuff is leader-based, which means it can reach agreement across the network really quickly. And Hyperliquid's adaptation, HyperBFT, is designed to do exactly that. It processes transactions super fast, and confirmations are almost instant.
So it's like, unlike some other blockchains where you have to wait for multiple confirmations here, you get that one block finality, like they call it. So once it's done, it's done.
Right, exactly. It's about as close to instant as you can get in the blockchain world.
Okay, so that's how they achieve consensus. Now let's talk about how they actually make things happen on the chain. And they have this interesting setup with Hypercore and Hyper EVM. Let's start with Hypercore. What is that all about?
So Hypercore is essentially the engine for all the trading activity. It's where they have their fully on-chain perpetual futures and spot order books. And what's really impressive is the level of transparency. Everything is on-chain. Every order, cancellation, trade, even liquidations, you can see it all.
And this is where that one block finality really comes into play, right? Because everything is happening so fast and it's finalized immediately.
Exactly. And they're talking about some pretty incredible numbers, like a current throughput of 200,000 orders per second.
200,000 orders per second. That's mind-blowing. And they're saying they're still optimizing it to push that even higher.
Yeah, it really shows you the kind of performance they're aiming for. They're trying to bridge that gap between centralized and decentralized exchanges, maybe even open the door to new types of high-frequency trading that just weren't possible before.
Okay, so Hypercore is all about speed and transparency, but then they have this other component, Hyper EVM. So tell me about that.
Right. So as the name suggests, Hyper EVM brings the Ethereum virtual machine EVM into the Hyperliquid ecosystem.
So they're bringing that familiar smart contract platform that everyone knows from Ethereum onto Hyperliquid.
Exactly. And that's what makes this approach so interesting. Hyperliquid isn't just a really fast trading engine. It's a platform where you can build other applications too.
So developers can actually tap into all this high performance liquidity and financial tools that are built into Hypercore and use those as building blocks for their own innovations.
Precisely. So you have Hypercore, the super fast liquid base layer, and then Hyper EVM lets developers build all sorts of things on top of it, leveraging that speed and liquidity.
It sounds like a really powerful combination.
It definitely has the potential to create some really interesting synergies. The more applications you have built on Hyper EVM that are interacting with the liquidity on Hypercore, the more valuable the entire ecosystem becomes.
Right, so it all kind of feeds back into itself. Now, their documentation goes into a lot of detail about all these other components. I don't think we need to go through every single one, but maybe we can just touch on some key pieces to get a sense of the scope.
Sure. So they have things like staking the bridge for moving assets between chains, API servers for developers, a clearinghouse to manage risk, an oracle to provide price feeds, the order book itself, multi-sig for security, all the essential parts of a functioning blockchain ecosystem.
Right. And they also have something called Hyperliquid Improvement Proposals, or HIPs.
Yeah, the HIPs are interesting. HIP-1 is focused on creating a native token standard for Hyperliquid, and HIP-2 is all about what they call hyperliquidity.
So it sounds like they're really thinking about how to establish clear rules for tokens within their ecosystem, and also how to kind of maximize the liquidity that's available on the platform.
Exactly. It's about creating a cohesive and liquid environment for all the different applications and assets that might exist on Hyperliquid.
And of course, they have a whole suite of trading features, perpetual assets, different order types, margining liquidations, funding rates, all the things you'd expect from a sophisticated trading platform.
Yeah, and they're not just covering the basics. They're also thinking about things like robust price indices, self-trade prevention, all the things that are important for maintaining a fair and healthy market.
And they're even exploring some more advanced features like Uniswap perpetuals, which they call hypers, tools for market makers, and these protocol-managed vaults, which sound pretty interesting.
Yeah, the vaults could be a really interesting way for users to kind of pool their capital together and maybe automate certain strategies or participate in liquidity provision in a more structured way.
Right, and they have these specific roles for leaders and depositors, so it seems like they're thinking about how to manage these pooled resources effectively.
Yeah, definitely thinking about governance and permissions within these vaults.
And, they're also doing a lot of the things that are important for long-term sustainability, things like validator support, a referral system, a point system for engagement, historical data bounties, security audits, all the hallmarks of a project that's taking security and community building seriously.
Absolutely. These are all critical for building trust and ensuring that the platform is both secure and engaging for users.
And for developers, they have detailed API documentation information about their bridge and how to deploy assets on Hyper EVM.
Right. And it's interesting how they have this dual block architecture with Hypercore and Hyper EVM operating somewhat independently, even though they're part of the same layer 1.
So how do developers navigate this dual block structure? Like, what are the key things they need to understand?
Well, the documentation talks about how Hyper EVM interacts with Hypercore and how you can wrap Hype tokens so they can be used on Hyper EVM. It's about understanding how to seamlessly move assets and interact with the different components of the platform.
Okay, so that's a pretty good overview of Hyperliquid. It's clear they've put a lot of thought into building a really high-performance layer 1 that's specifically designed for on-chain finance with a strong emphasis on speed, transparency, and extensibility.
Yeah, it seems like they're really trying to push the boundaries of what's possible in terms of decentralized trading and financial applications.
Okay, so now let's shift gears completely and talk about Aerodrome Finance. Their tagline is, the next generation AMM designed to serve as Base's central liquidity hub. So right away, we know they're playing a specific role within a specific ecosystem.
Exactly. Hyperliquid is its own layer 1, but Aerodrome is an application. It's an AMM that's built on Base, and Base, as you know, is a layer 2 scaling solution for Ethereum from Coinbase.
So Aerodrome is all about facilitating token swaps and concentrating liquidity within the Base network.
Exactly, and they're drawing on some pretty interesting innovations. They specifically mentioned that they've incorporated the latest advancements from Velodrome V2.
And Velodrome was a pretty influential project over on Optimism. So what are some of the key mechanisms that Aerodrome might have borrowed?
Well, the big thing with Velodrome and now Aerodrome is this really powerful liquidity incentive engine. It's driven by a vote-locked governance model, sometimes called V-tokenomics, and it's all about aligning the incentives of everyone involved, the liquidity providers, the voters, the protocol itself.
And Aerodrome actually launched on Base back in August of 2023, so it's been live for a while now.
Right, and that launch date is important because it shows they're not just theoretical, they're actually out there operating in the real world.
Okay, so let's break down these Aerodrome mechanics a bit. How does it actually attract liquidity to make those token swaps happen?
Well, does it by rewarding liquidity providers, LPs, with emissions of its native token, which is called AERO.
So if you provide liquidity to one of their pools, you get rewarded in AERO tokens.
Right, but there's a really important caveat here. The AERO rewards aren't just given out randomly. They're distributed proportionally based on how many votes each liquidity pool gets.
So it's not enough to just provide liquidity.
Yeah.
You need people to vote for your pool to maximize your rewards.
Exactly. And the only liquidity that's eligible for those AERO emissions is the liquidity that's been staked in these special contracts called gauges.
Okay, gauges, got it. So how do people actually get the power to vote for these pools?
That's where the AERO token comes in. If you lock up your AERO tokens, you get this AERO token, which is actually an NFT, a non-fungible token, and holding that AERO NFT gives you voting power.
So the more AERO you lock up, the more voting power you have.
Exactly. And the AERO holders aren't just voting out of the goodness of their hearts, they also get rewarded for participating.
Right. There's always an incentive in crypto.
Mm.
So what do these AERO voters get?
They get 100% of the trading fees that the Aerodrome protocol generated in the previous week.
Wow. So they get a share of the fees, and it's all based on how much Vero they're holding.
Exactly. Plus, they might get some additional voter incentives depending on what's going on in a given week.
So you're incentivized to lock up your AERO, get that AERO, and then vote strategically to try and maximize your share of the fees.
Precisely. And it all operates on this 7-day cycle that they call an epoch, which starts every Thursday at midnight UTC.
So all the voting, the emissions, the fee distribution, everything happens on this weekly cadence.
Yeah, it keeps things moving and allows the system to adapt to changes in the market.
Okay, let's talk about the tokens themselves. They have AERO, which is their standard ERC20 token, and then they have AERO, which is the governance NFT. So how are these tokens distributed and what are their main uses?
So AERO is mainly used for emissions. It's what gets distributed to liquidity providers as rewards. But AERO is purely for governance, and you get it by locking up your AERO tokens in this process called vote escrowing.
And the longer you lock up your AERO, the more AERO voting power you get, right?
Right, exactly. They give this example. If you lock up 100 AERO, for the full 4 years, you get 100 AERO. But if you only lock it up for 1 year, you only get 25 favor AERO.
Wow, so there's a big incentive to lock it up for as long as possible.
Definitely, the longer you lock up, the more you're showing your commitment to the protocol and the more influence you have over governance.
Now, they also have this Automax lock feature. What's that all about?
So Automax lock basically treats your AERO as if it were locked for the full 4 years, even if you chose a shorter lockup period.
Okay, so it simplifies things for people who just want to set it and forget it.
Exactly. You get that maximum voting power without having to actively manage your lockup periods.
Now, looking at their initial distribution of AERO, it seems like a huge chunk of it, 450 million out of the total, 500 million was allocated as vote locked, AERO. So where did all that Mero go initially?
Well, the biggest portion, 40%, went to existing holders of Velo over on Optimism. It was kind of like an airdrop to bootstrap adoption and bring over a community that's already familiar with these V tokenomics.
So they're leveraging that existing knowledge and experience.
Exactly. And then big chunks also went to things like a public goods fund, the foundation, and something called Flight School. And all of these were automatically max locked, so they're in it for the long haul.
Right. And the remaining 50 million AERO that wasn't locked up was used for things like ongoing voter incentives and initial liquidity incentives.
Yes. Yeah, so they've really structured their distribution to prioritize long-term governance and ecosystem development right from the start.
Okay, so let's talk about the AERO emissions schedule. It looks like they have a pretty sophisticated multi-phase approach.
Yeah, they do. They started with a weekly emission of 10 million AERO, and then they have these 3 phases, takeoff, cruise, and AeroFed.
Okay, tell me about these phases.
So takeoff is the first 14 weeks, and during this phase, the emissions actually increase by 3% each week.
So they're really front-loading the emissions to kind of jumpstart things.
Exactly. It's about attracting new users and getting the ecosystem going.
And then after takeoff comes cruise.
All right, so cruise starts after week 14, and during this phase, the emissions gradually decrease by 1% per epoch.
So they're slowly tapering off the emissions as the protocol matures.
Exactly. And then the third phase, AeroFed, is where things get really interesting.
Okay, what happens in AeroFed?
So AeroFed kicks in around epoch 67, which is when the weekly emissions drop below 9 million AERO. And at this point, the AERO holders get to vote on the monetary policy.
So they can actually vote on how many AERO tokens get emitted each week.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. They can vote to increase the emissions by 0.01% of the total supply, decrease them by the same amount, or just keep them the same. And it's all decided by a simple majority vote.
Wow, so the AERO holders literally have control over the money supply. That's a huge level of decentralization. Okay, so to sum it all up, Hyperliquid is building this high-throughput Layer 1 with a clear focus on on-chain trading and a wide array of financial applications. They're pushing the boundaries of speed and performance, and they're creating a platform that's open for others to build on.
And Aerodrome has carved out a critical role for itself within the base ecosystem as the central liquidity hub. They've implemented this really innovative V-tokenomics model that empowers the community and incentivizes both liquidity provision and active governance.
It's a lot to think about, but that's what makes this space so exciting. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, until next time.
See you later.